Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very exciting event. I'd like to begin with some remarks about how this is going to go. In other words, I'd like to mention that following the presentation, I will moderate a question and answer period because we are unable to use an audience microphone at this time. Please remain seated and simply raise your hand if you have a question. Everyone in attendance, both in person and remotely, may also submit questions during the presentation using the link sent by the box office earlier today. It is my great pleasure to preside tonight over what is a celebration of Dr. Alexander Carpenter's academic career. Named a professor at the University of Alberta, represents the ultimate achievement for a faculty member received in recognition, in this case, for exceptional and eminent contributions to the intellectual life of the university. It is not bestowed lightly or easily, and thus it's a mark of great achievement and merit. As well, the road to such a distinction is arduous and physically as well as intellectually demanding. Think of how hard it is to think, to write, to publish, and to teach at this level and as successfully as Dr. Carpenter has done for many years. While preparing my notes for tonight, I was reminded of W.B. Yeats's description of what it takes to imagine, to compose in one's mind, and to write down, in his case, a single line of poetry. And so I want to read some lines from Adam's Curse, in which he says that it's really hard, and it's physically hard to do any of these things, although at the same time you need to make it as though it's effortless. I said, writes Yeats, a line will take us hours maybe. Yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. Better go down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement or break stones like an old pauper in all kinds of weather. For to articulate sweet sounds together, it is work harder than all this, and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen, the martyrs call the world. Though I won't be able to reproduce here the entire effort that has brought Dr. Carpenter to this point of singular distinction, let me present an abbreviated roadmap with various steps along the way of his journey. Dr. Carpenter is a musicologist, a music critic, a teacher, and a rock musician, as many of you will know. He studied voice and music history at Brock University. He went on to study music criticism at McMaster University, and he also studied historical musicology at the University of Toronto, earning a doctorate in 2004. Prior to joining Augustana in 2006, Dr. Carpenter taught music history and theory across the country from the University of Prince Edward Island in the East Coast to McMaster University, the University of Western Ontario, and the renowned Glenn Gould School in Toronto. At Augustana, he has served as Director of Music from 2013 to 2016 and as Chair of the Fine Arts and Humanities Department from 2016 to 2019. Last year he was on sabbatical, and nonetheless he continued to serve as the chair of the Academic Advisory Board of the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies. Anyone knowing Dr. Carpenter or looking at his history of teaching, scholarly research, and service shall be impressed immediately by the depth and the breadth of his work, his commitment to the intellectual life of the institution and the academy, and to his devotion to his students and craft. His interests in both scholarship and teaching are both wide-ranging and eclectic, and he brings to them a passion and an inquisitive, active thoughtfulness. His research areas range from the music of Arnold Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School, turn of the century Vienna, to popular music, to music and psychoanalysis, and even to zombies in popular culture and also film music. Dr. Carpenter's research has received much attention over the years and garnered many awards and grants. And it has been published frequently and widely in such leading journals as the Music Quarterly, Studia Musicolica, Journal of Popular Culture, and Psychoanalysis and History. He has contributed entries to dictionaries, encyclopedias, and guides, such as the Guide to Classical Music. His CD, DVD, and book reviews have appeared in many academic and popular journals, and his essay, Dead in Tune, Uncanny Muzak in Dawn of the Dead, received the Popular Culture Association 2013 Russell B. Nye Award for outstanding article published in the Journal of Popular Culture. He is now hard at work on a book project on the early history of the Gothic rock for Lexington Press. Dr. Carpenter has also served the academic community as a referee for a number of academic presses and various journals, and as a member of a number of journal boards and academic bodies, including the College of Fellows of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. Dr. Carpenter is emerging as a public intellectual and has been interviewed on Canada's National Radio Service, the CBC, on topics ranging from popular to classical music. Interestingly, he has also been interviewed on the U.S. National Public Radio system on the subject of zombies in popular culture and by the New York Times on the topic of psychoanalysis and opera. Dr. Carpenter has delivered lectures and conference presentations in both North America and Europe. His status as an important voice on various musical topics and musicology may be gauged by the fact that significantly he has given several public lectures on music and psychoanalysis at the Sigmund Freud Museums in London and in Vienna. And in 2018, he was visiting professor at the University of Vienna's Institute of Musicology, and the following year he was a visiting professor at the University of Innsbruck's Institute of Musicology as well. His teaching aligns nicely with his scholarly interests, since he teaches courses in music history, musicology and theory, aesthetics, oral skills, but also cultural history, interdisciplinary study, as well as courses in popular culture and popular music, film, as well as a biannual place-based learning course on Viennese musical and cultural history, which is taught in Austria. He also does an annual interdisciplinary liberal arts seminar on zombies in popular culture. A passionate and popular teacher, Dr. Carpenter continues to bring into his classroom his disciplinary and interdisciplinary training and interests, and always he brings into the classroom current research, where his ideas, of course, in the classroom find fertile ground and benefit our students here at Augustana and elsewhere greatly. I would like to give the last word to Dr. Carpenter himself. I'm particularly proud, he says in a recent self-reflection about his research and teaching at Augustana, I'm particularly proud of the fact that my research program has become more robust and more interdisciplinary during my time at Augustana, and has even branched out over the past few years to include new subfields, including film music and 18th century music. I credit much of what I have been able to accomplish as a researcher to a key element of Augustana's mission, namely the cultivation of a lively collegial academic culture of research, creativity, and public engagement in which students are invited to participate. This dynamic, interactive culture has given me encouragement and has provided me with the opportunity to share my research with colleagues and students on campus, to collaborate with other faculty members on interdisciplinary research projects, to integrate my research into my teaching, to receive funding to support my endeavors, and to work directly with undergraduate research assistants. And that statement contains, I would suggest to you, all those elements that go into making somebody a great professor, but also a great teacher. As many of you would know from his recent column in the Camrose Booster, to which he has contributed an impressive 26 columns over the years in the second thought section, one of the topics Dr. Carpenter has been researching and writing about in this, the year of the 250th anniversary of the great composer's Beethoven's birth, he's been writing about Beethoven. I think some of what was in the Camrose Booster article we'll probably hear about tonight. The topic of his distinguished professorial lecture this evening is music, as you can see, for a later age, Beethoven as a symbol of the modern Vienna 1900. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carpenter as he shares with us tonight an exploration of turn-of-the-century Vienna and offers certain insights about Beethoven in the context of the artistic rebirth and progress for the moderns, but also Beethoven's role as protector against the revolutionary music that threatened Vienna for the conservative audience and critics. Please join me in welcoming, you've heard enough from me, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carpenter, who is going to give now his distinguished professorial lecture. So, Alex. Good luck.
Distinguished indeed. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to those of you who are watching online. I'm honored by your presence, and I'm grateful for your interest. This is a very special milestone in my academic career, and one that I was by no means certain that I would achieve. I appreciate you attending this lecture to mark this achievement with me, and I will plan to speak for about 35 minutes, and then I will be happy to take any questions. Before I begin, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to acknowledge the three most important people in my life who I'm very happy to say are here, I think are here, they are here. My wife, better known at our house as the goddess Anastasia, my high school sweetheart, my very best friend, my soulmate of 30 years, which we will celebrate in a few weeks. She gets terribly nervous at events like these because she worries that I won't finish writing the lecture in time, which is a reasonable concern. And she's also the smartest person I know, and she always gives me sage advice, and for tonight, her advice was, try not to be boring. My brilliant children are here, my beautiful, beloved daughter Sydney, who is well on her way to becoming a nurse, following in her mother's footsteps. And after some very tumultuous teenage years, the irony is delicious. She has blessed us with 2 perfect grandchildren, is a wonderful mother herself, and I couldn't possibly be more proud of her. And the boy, my son Declan, every day when I look at him, I see a perfected version of me. He's more talented, he's much taller, and marginally more handsome. But at the same time, he has always been his own guy. There is absolutely no one on this planet who is like him, and I adore him for that. And if there is anything distinguished about me, notwithstanding the very kind remarks of my dean, it is that I am bound to these 3 exquisite humans, and anything worthwhile that I have ever achieved has been because of them and for them, and them alone. So, on to Beethoven. Why? Well, it is the Beethoven year. Ludwig van Beethoven was born 250 years ago in Bonn, Germany, and global celebrations of the man and his music carry on apace, despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And while I'll focus primarily on Beethoven in the context of the early 20th century in Vienna and how his legacy was interpreted and put to use at that time by both modern musicians and artists and by their opponents, it is the case that the interpretation, and perhaps we could say the instrumentalization of Beethoven, not quite in the Kantian sense of an immoral misuse of someone, but certainly as a means of achieving an end. This has been ongoing since the composer's death in 1827, and indeed, as I will show you, it continues to this day. So the title of my talk, Beethoven as a Symbol of the Modern in Vienna 1900, is slightly misleading, and I hope you will forgive me. Tonight I will talk about Beethoven in Fin de siècle Vienna, but I will also range back into the 19th century and forward through the 20th century, wrapping up in the present moment. Beethoven, as the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek claims, has been a prime example of an empty signifier, a word or concept or a symbol that has become unmoored from a stable referent, such that it has begun to absorb rather than emit meaning, to absorb rather than emit meaning. One of the most famous examples of an empty signifier, or a floating signifier, which is appropriate for this example, is the shark from the movie Jaws. The shark has been interpreted in so many different ways, the argument goes, that it no longer means one thing. Rather, it takes on the capacity to mean many different things, some of them contradictory. Among possible meanings for the shark, and here I'll quote the art historian Rex Butler, the forces of nature fighting back as humans increasingly encroach on its territory, the eruption of sexuality, the shark appears in the film after two teenagers attempt to have sex in the water, the threat of the third world to America, the shark, like illegal immigrants, arrives by the sea, and the excesses of capitalism as revenge for the greed of the town mayor and the resort owners who refuse to close the beach during a busy holiday weekend. And it is not so much that the shark tells us something about society and the times that produced it. Rather, it is that interpreters bring something with them to say about society, and they attribute it to the shark. In so doing, they fail to recognize a fundamental circular pattern in which, as Butler concludes, the shark embodies, in his words, certain tendencies that have already been attributed to the shark. And if we need additional examples to clarify this notion of the empty signifier, we could look at zombies in popular culture, as I do, or perhaps more pressingly for us these days, the increasingly malleable concept of fake news. What does this have to do with Beethoven? The argument for Beethoven as an empty signifier concerns the composer's magnificent Ninth Symphony, which contains the well-known setting of German poet Friedrich Schiller's An die Freude, which we know as Ode to Joy. The symphony is commonly thought of as an anthem to universal brotherhood and freedom, a testament to music's power to communicate and to unify. As the symphony nears its conclusion, Beethoven and Schiller enjoin us, "Be embraced, all you millions. Share this kiss with all the world." But as Žižek insists, what the Ninth Symphony has become is ideological, through serving as a kind of empty vessel that is capable of containing the widest imaginable range of sentiments. And Žižek lists some of the curious ways Beethoven's Ninth has been employed as evidence of what he calls its, quote, universal adaptability. juxtaposed with extreme violence in Stanley Kubrick's film A Clockwork Orange, as nationalistic fodder for the Nazis, used by the communist regimes in China and the Soviet Union, and by the apartheid right in South Rhodesia, and more recently, as the anthem of the European Union. Beethoven proves readily adaptable to capitalism and consumerism too, not just to the utopian left or the dictatorial right. Ode to Joy has recently been used in a Samsung commercial featuring David Beckham, in a commercial for Lowe's, the home improvement store, and to advertise, a few years ago, Nintendo's Wii gaming system. As recently as this past summer, in this time of pandemic and lockdowns, musicians in Italy began spontaneously performing socially distanced versions of Ode to Joy from apartment balconies, with musicians in Germany soon following suit, hinting again at the notion of Beethoven's music as fundamentally unifying, a kiss shared with the world in a time of fear, isolation, and loneliness. Beethoven has always been changeable, it seems. It's worth noting that Beethoven has not always been the titanic, towering figure he is today. For many people, he is the symbol, the very symbol of classical music, and also of the great and suffering artist. During his lifetime, and in the decades following his death, opinions about Beethoven were decidedly mixed. Vienna itself was bifurcated along partisan lines, those who venerated the great master and those who thought he was nuts. A Viennese music critic wrote in 1804, for example, that, quote, Beethoven's Second Symphony is a crass monster, a hideously writhing, wounded dragon that refuses to expire, and though bleeding in the finale, furiously beats about with its tail erect. In 1828, just a year after Beethoven's death, a German critic in Leipzig characterized the entire Ninth Symphony as, quote, a most notable mistake of the now redeemed man, made unfortunate by his complete deafness. 20 years later, a French critic called Beethoven's Opus 106 Piano Sonata, quote, a raw and undigested mass. And even at the very end of the 19th century, the glorious Ninth Symphony continued to vex listeners around the world. In 1899, the American music critic Philip Hale claimed that fans of Beethoven were fetishists, and he lamented, quote, but oh, the pages of stupid and hopelessly vulgar music, the unspeakable cheapness of the chief tune, Freude, Freude, joy, joy. We view Beethoven today through the lens of Romanticism, and our understanding of the composer and his musical accomplishments is predicated on the heroic paradigm. That is, that Beethoven was a revolutionary figure. As the cultural historian John Clubb puts it, a musical and political revolutionary whose music, quote, reflects both the turmoil of the age in which he lived and, no less, the turmoil within himself. While this is no doubt true, it's also the case that Beethoven's music was modern. To his contemporaries, sometimes too modern. As Alex Ross, the music critic for The New Yorker, wrote a few years ago, Beethoven's music has, quote, the aura of history unfolding before our ears. The title for my lecture tonight is a paraphrase of Beethoven's own words when he was confronted by musicians who had tried out and then refused to play his Opus 59 string quartets, the so-called Razumovsky quartets. The cellist reputedly tossed his score on the ground and began stomping on it in frustration. The first violinist shouted at Beethoven, "This is not music." Beethoven replied, "It is not for you. It is for a later age." The great German music critic A.B. Marx, writing again about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, just 1 year before Beethoven died, observed the following. If one wishes to say, though, that the great artist abolishes all hitherto applicable laws and has to be measured by an entirely new standard that he himself brings along, then this tenet is certainly true in general with regard to the historical progress of art and criticism. It cannot be extended so far, though, as to overturn all the fundamental concepts of an art, which is in any case out of the question with human judgment and understanding in general. Neither I nor anyone else would be able to make a judgment on such a subject, since there would be no recognizable distinction between the nature of art and the subjective capriciousness of the artist. And every intimation expressed with such grand power would have to be regarded as the best and highest of art. So here Marx provides us with a very fine account of the historical problem of the modern, or perhaps we should say modernism, which is as acute in 1826 as it was at the dawn of the Baroque era in 1600, or at the turn of the century in Central Europe. Art progresses through the new standards that the great artist brings. But this progress is always in a fundamental tension with convention and the past. Too much progress, too much iconoclasm, too much subjectivity, and our understanding of art collapses. Or rather, we would simply have to allow that the new modern art was always already the greatest art of all time, since we couldn't comprehend it. It is this modern Beethoven to whom I want to turn now and to consider his ambivalent role in the birth of Viennese modern music. If I could be alive at another time in history and in another place, that game, when and where would that be? Vienna, in the decade before the First World War. And this is me in Vienna, overlooking Michaelerplatz, St. Michael's Square. For your interest, if you've been to Vienna, this is me on the balcony of the Hofburg, the Imperial Palace, looking down into St. Michael's Square. That is St. Michael's Church, a medieval church. The foundations are from about the 10th century, 11th century. And there's a Starbucks down there somewhere too. But you should know, the reason for the shit-eating grin on my face is that is the emperor's private balcony that I had no business being on. And there's a story as to how I got there, which I will tell another time. The capital city of the Austrian Empire had undergone a substantial facelift a few decades earlier. Its fortified walls taken down and replaced with a tree-lined boulevard, along which grand neoclassical buildings, the Parliament, the Natural History and Art Museums, the Burgtheater, the new university buildings sprang up. A rich, if highly partisan, cafe culture flourished, and depending on your affiliation, one might be seated on any given day near a great writer like Arthur Schnitzler, or an influential journalist like Karl Kraus, or political refugees like Trotsky or Stalin, or the painter Gustav Klimt, or the composer Gustav Mahler, or the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. The city's socially repressive and politically volatile climate and its polarized cultural landscape would give birth to the Wiener Moderne, an aesthetic and intellectual paradigm shift that threw art, philosophy, design, literature, and music into a state of crisis and uncertainty. Vienna became the focal point of European modernism, and the city at the turn of the century was, as scholars note, where it was expressed in its purest form. The young generation of Viennese modernists oriented themselves towards the future and towards the wider world, struggling against tradition and entrenched cultural institutions determined to hang on to the homey mid-19th century bourgeois tradition that had long defined the city. From this tumult, Beethoven arose, resurrected as a potent symbol for the Viennese modernists. In 1897, a group of artists had formed the Vienna Secession movement, breaking away from the traditional art scene of the city and establishing their own Art Nouveau building to exhibit modern art and to celebrate the avant-garde. In 1902, to honor the 75th anniversary of the death of Beethoven, two major artworks were featured in the Secession building: Gustav Klimt's Beethoven frieze and Max Klinger's statue of Beethoven. The building itself was transformed inside to resemble a temple, with Klinger's Beethoven at the center and Klimt's massive 6-panel mural adorning 3 walls in the adjoining room. The overarching theme of the exhibition was the struggle to overcome negative internal and external forces towards the pursuit of joy and fulfillment, which can be realized through art, or rather in this case, through music. Max Klinger's statue seems to clearly present Beethoven as Prometheus, overseen by an eagle representing Zeus. Prometheus was the god who gave fire to humanity and who taught it the civilizing arts. Beethoven thus assumes the role of a divine figure symbolizing human knowing, striving, and creating. Klinger spent 15 years on his 5,000-kilogram polychrome Beethoven statue, which is comprised of a combination of marble, ivory, and bronze. While it was the centerpiece of the Secession's Beethoven exhibit in 1902, with Klimt's mural as merely an accompaniment, in the intervening years, Klinger has been largely forgotten. Klimt has since become one of Vienna's most famous cultural icons, and the Beethoven frieze is now regarded as one of his most important works. Klinger's statue, when originally unveiled, was roundly criticized in Vienna as an insufficient tribute. Beethoven is nearly dwarfed by his throne, and the depiction of the composer as hunched over with clenched fists and partially clothed struck many as irreverent. But taken in concert with Klimt's richly symbolic mural, it became clear that Beethoven is here understood not merely as a revolutionary, but as an otherworldly figure. Klinger's representation of Beethoven as a god perhaps hints at Schiller's words heard in the final movement of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony. Freude, schöne Götterfunke, joy, beautiful spark of the gods. But as it turns out, Klinger's Beethoven is also John the Evangelist. The eagle is the symbol of both Zeus and John the Evangelist, and the back of the throne, if you could see it, includes a depiction of the crucifixion alongside an image of the birth of Venus. And then between these images, Christian and classical, is the figure of John the Evangelist. And if we weren't sure about Klinger's intentions, an examination of the evangelist's face confirms it. Klinger has given him Beethoven's features. As the musicologist Anna Celenza has asserted, for Klinger, music provided the link between the physical and the spiritual realms, and Beethoven, in providing that link, was, quote, the evangelical prophet of a new age in art. Gustav Klimt, in his mural, also seems to be alluding to Beethoven's Ninth, perhaps in recognition of the symphony's, quote, obstreperous roarings of modern frenzy, as one music critic described it in 1825. Klimt does not admit as much, but art historians agree it is likely a paraphrase of Beethoven's Final Symphony, although it is very abstract. Klimt himself provides a narrative sketch of the mural. This isn't the complete mural. This is as much as I could fit on one slide. It begins with a longing for happiness, with weak humanity beseeching the knight in shining armor to aid them in their struggle. The hostile powers appear, with references to classical mythology, including a giant and 3 gorgons. There are personifications of sickness, mania, death, desire, and impurity, but the desires of mankind fly above and beyond them. On the final panels, art leads to the kingdom of the ideal and to pure joy, happiness and love, symbolized by a couple in a rapturous embrace. There is a choir of heavenly angels on the final panel who are, according to Klimt himself, singing Schiller's words, joy, beautiful spark of the gods, and this kiss for the whole world. The frieze is, according to the art historian Peter Vergo, a, quote, far-reaching allegory of the power of music, and in particular, the abstract, inward nature of music, end quote. As an aside, I often visit the Secession Building in Vienna, and I have seen this remarkable work of art up close many times. Like all of Klimt's major works, it is astonishing when you see it in person, and such a viewing is an intense and rewarding experience. However, every time I go to see the Beethoven frieze, I have to reread Klimt's essay, the catalog entry for the piece, because it does not make a bit of sense to me at all. And all I ever remember is the gorilla. This work was pivotal for Klimt and for the development of Viennese aesthetic modernism as a whole. It sums up his earlier period, and it marks the beginning of his so-called golden period, the works of which are most strongly associated with Vienna at this time. And the mural contains shadowy intimations of future works, perhaps most notably, if you know it, his famous painting, The Kiss. Beethoven, for Klimt, serves as a locus of the modern, through the symbolic representation of Beethoven, his apotheosis. The Viennese modern art movement binds itself to the notion of music as a kingdom not of this world, as the most attuned to the inner world of all the arts. Klimt's artistic transition, likewise, was a decisive turn inwards to probe the depths of the unconscious. The critical response to Klimt's mural was predictably negative. Like much of Klimt's work, it was condemned as pornographic, and in one review, accused of achieving the pinnacle of obscenity in art. It is clear, though, that the issue is not simply that the mural contains nudes, and rather, like the criticism of Klinger's Beethoven, what is at play is Beethoven's universal adaptability. For Klimt, Beethoven underwrites the modernist project. For Klimt's critics, Beethoven is a sacred cow, a bulwark against this very modernism. What is truly obscene are not the bare breasts or the pubic hair, but the lack of proper respect for Beethoven. But the Beethoven exhibition at the Secession gets even more complicated on deeper investigation. Klimt, provocatively, gave the figure of the knight in shining armor who stands against the hostile forces, the titanic gorilla, the lascivious women who represent human degradation. He gave the knight the face of his contemporary, the composer Gustav Mahler. Mahler also participated in the Beethoven Secession exhibition in 1902, conducting his own modest arrangement of an excerpt from the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy, in the Secession Building. There's a funny story associated with that, and that is that Mahler was trying to get the musicians of the Vienna Philharmonic to play, and they refused to play, essentially, to take on an overtime gig. They refused, and all Mahler could get was 6 trombonists. So you can imagine how that went. Mahler was the only Viennese composer to participate in this celebration of Beethoven, curiously enough. And Mahler was widely despised by the Viennese press, who disparaged him as much too modern. Mahler had conducted Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in Vienna 2 years earlier and had been brutally attacked by critics for his approach. And this is a quote from the review at that time. Melody is detached and isolated from the sound fabric as if with a scalpel. Mahler has asserted himself as a modernist, at least insofar as this modern age drives towards science. Mahler, like Klimt and like Klinger, is too modern and insufficiently awestruck in the presence of Beethoven, and too Jewish, for that matter, for Vienna's cultured anti-Semites, who complained that, quote, instead of silencing Mahler, the grandeur of the Ninth Symphony has aroused his intellect, and he has scaled its heights with clever interpretations and details. Mahler certainly wasn't the only modern Jewish composer the Viennese critics despised, and against whom they pitted the legacy of Beethoven. On December 21st, 1908, Vienna's Bösendorfer Hall hosted a performance of a new string quartet by the young composer Arnold Schoenberg, paired with Beethoven's Opus 74 string quartet, which is nicknamed the Harp. Schoenberg, whom we now know as the father of modern music, or sometimes as the boogeyman of modern music, was in 1908 a fledgling composer whose music had been moving ever closer to atonality, or what Schoenberg called the emancipation of dissonance. Music free from the confines of key, in which every note is equal and has meaning in relation to the notes around it and not as part of a prescribed tonal hierarchy. This music was also expressionistic, like the art of Klimt and his contemporaries, and no doubt under the influence of Freudian psychoanalysis. Schoenberg sought to turn the self inside out, to allow music to be subjective and to freely express the deep, dark truths of the unconscious. His Opus 10 string quartet was revolutionary in a number of ways. It wasn't entirely atonal, but the final two movements came very close to atonality. And it included a singer. Schoenberg was the first composer to add a singing part to a string quartet, an echo of Beethoven's own addition of singers to the final movement of the Ninth Symphony. And the text Schoenberg chose for the quartet's last two movements by the German poet Stefan George speak of the suffering endured by the modern artist and of the desire to leave the world behind. Perhaps the most famous moment in the quartet is near the beginning of the final movement, when the soprano hauntingly sings, "I feel the air of other planets," as the strings gently seem to slip the bonds of tonality. The premiere of Schoenberg's Opus 10 quartet, a riot broke out. Audience members began laughing, then jeering, then booing and hissing, while Schoenberg's devotees tried to counter with loud applause. Members of the audience, including a contingent of partisan music critics, led the assault, calling for the soprano, Marie Goethals-Schoder, to stop singing. "Stop! We've had enough. Don't try to make fools of us." Goethals-Schoder burst into tears, but continued performing the quartet to its completion. Immediately afterwards, the music critic Paul Stauber shouted to Ludwig Bösendorfer, the owner of the concert hall, "Beethoven is next on the program. You'd better ventilate the auditorium." As this remark suggests, Vienna's conservative critics and audiences regarded Beethoven as antipode and perhaps antidote to Schoenberg's modern music, which the critic Hans Liebstockel described as, quote, bitter, tasteless, confused ugliness. In a delightful example of fin de siècle gaslighting, the critic Ludwig Carpenter, who had been accused of being one of the critics instigating the riot, wrote a letter to the Neue Musikzeitung, insisting that he didn't start the riot, as had been suggested, but admitted that he had been led on by others. And he did participate because he was only a human being of flesh and blood. I've mislabeled this slide. It's Carpenter. So he concludes, and here's the gaslighting part, after admitting that he participated. Let's turn the tables and ask ourselves, how lunatic must Schoenberg's quartet be if even a seasoned crusader of new music like me, who harbors not the slightest ill will against Schoenberg, and who even now cherishes not the slightest trace of animosity, could suddenly turn into a scandalmonger. So here's the rub. Schoenberg's ultramodern quartet, one of Schoenberg's earliest atonal works, breathing the air of other planets with its free-floating dissonance as it ushers in the era of musical modernism, is underwritten by Beethoven. Schoenberg's quartet was premiered side by side with a Beethoven quartet, and the original concert program contained a reprint of a historic negative review of that same Beethoven quartet, immediately suggesting an affinity between the two composers by virtue of a shared history of being misheard and mistreated by critics. Moreover, Schoenberg's quartet contains motivic quotations, small germinal musical ideas derived from Beethoven's quartets, including one from the infamous Opus 59 quartets, those Beethoven characterized as for a later age. Schoenberg also identifies as one of his key techniques what he calls juxtaposition, the side-by-side placement of seemingly unrelated thematic materials. This, he says, is derived from Beethoven, notably from the same quartet that was paired with Schoenberg's Opus 10 at the Bösendorfer premiere concert. In his textbook, Structural Functions of Harmony, Schoenberg makes it clear that the tonal dissolution evident in his music, which so vexed audience and critics in the early 20th century in Vienna, was already present in Beethoven's music. Again, Schoenberg uses the Opus 59 quartets as an example. It was already present as what Schoenberg calls endangered tonality, harmonic progressions that undermine and weaken a sense of key. Schoenberg could very well be talking about the harmonic procedures in his own string quartet here, thereby bringing Beethoven into the present as a fellow modern. And if that weren't enough, consider again Schoenberg's inclusion of a vocal part in his string quartet for the first time in history. It was a revolutionary gesture, to be sure, playing a key role in the advent of musical modernism, but embedded in this revolutionary modern gesture is the specter of Beethoven, who had added voices to his final symphony almost 85 years earlier. Schoenberg, for his entire life, was a devotee of what he called new music, music that strove to express something new in a new way. This was the hallmark, or the honor code, in his words, of great art. For Schoenberg, inventing the modern style in fin de siècle Vienna, Beethoven's music was new music. And I'll conclude now. In the recent book, Moonlighting, Beethoven and the Literary Modernism, the literary scholar Nathan Waddell makes the argument that Beethoven, or the Beethovenian legend, helped to shape the development of literary modernism, as it appears in the work of Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forrester, Aldous Huxley, and Wyndham Lewis, among others. Literary modernism is Beethovenian, Waddell argues, with respect to, quote, the challenges it offers to restrictive aesthetic norms, on the one hand, and to its valuing of the artist as a socially and politically transformative figure. It's possible, says Waddell, in his words, quote, to see Beethoven as a precursor of literary modernism in a broad sense, insofar as his life and music embodied a striving to celebrate the freedom of individual imagination in the face of an enchaining social structure. In other words, there are ways in which Beethoven puts the modern in literary modernism, just as Beethoven seems to put the modern in modern art and music in Vienna 1900. I promised at the outset to range from the 19th century to the 21st in this lecture. I started with Zizek's observation that the universal adaptability of Beethoven has meant that his music, having been used by so many disparate groups for so many disparate purposes, could be understood as absorbing rather than emitting meaning. There is ever more evidence of this moving through history. Schoenberg himself would turn to Beethoven again in 1942, at a time when Hitler's Third Reich was ravaging Europe, all to the tune of Beethoven, the favored composer of the Nazi regime. Schoenberg composed a setting of Byron's Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte, which included a quotation from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and hinted at the Third Symphony, which Beethoven had originally dedicated to Napoleon in the early 19th century. Schoenberg intended for his ode, with evocations of Beethoven, to serve as a pointed protest by a modern Jewish composer whose music had been banned as degenerate by the Nazis. A pointed protest against the rabid German nationalism that, for the Nazis, had its very roots in Beethoven's music. After the war, in the 1960s, the Black Power movement in the United States would surprisingly adopt Beethoven, with Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael both claiming that the composer was a Moor of mixed African and European descent. This idea of Black Beethoven as a kind of subversive icon of Black culture resurfaced as recently as this past summer when it began trending on Twitter in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. What does this all mean? Is Beethoven really just an empty signifier? In effect, a cipher, a zero, a blank slate upon which we now simply project whatever it is that we want or need? Perhaps Beethoven keeps resurfacing and being repurposed because he provides the imprimatur of quality, of enduring worth, of timelessness. But it is also the case that Beethoven seems perpetually relevant somehow, cycling through history in a kind of modernist eddy of revolution and renewal. And here we are this evening, talking about Beethoven. At the end of the 19th century, the composer Johannes Brahms would complain of Beethoven's legacy, quote, "You can't have any idea what it's like always to hear such a giant marching behind you." That same giant, just a few years later at the turn of the century, was no longer marching behind. Rather, he had already arrived in the later age. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. We're going to have a question and answer period, and I'm just waiting for the questions. Thank you. So the first question, well, it begins with, I think, what everyone's reaction is. Congratulations, Alex, it says. In what ways have you adjusted your teaching due to COVID-19 pandemic and still be able to attain the same learning objectives as before the pandemic?
Oh, good grief. Well, like all of my colleagues at Augustana, it's an ongoing challenge, and we're all experimenting with different approaches and different ideas, and some things are working surprisingly well, and some things are failing spectacularly. I participated in a teaching seminar a week or so ago as a panelist in a teaching seminar here at Augustana, and addressed basically the same question: what's working and what isn't working? And my conclusion was, well, there are some things that are working, but they're not working because of anything that I'm doing at all. It's really that the students are quite game, and the students are very understanding and are very flexible. So the things that are working, and the willingness of the students to engage and participate, I think that is that's to the credit of the students, largely. Speaking for myself.
Thanks, Alex. There's another question, but I think before I ask that question, maybe I can ask one of my own questions. And it's in the line of the question that you just answered. Speaking especially about music, where you use a lot of clips and that sort of thing. So you use electronic media, I would think, to demonstrate your points.
Yeah.
What do you think that COVID-19 and the way in which we're teaching right now, what will that mean for the future? Because it seems to me that we'll never go back to where we were pre-2019. But do you have any thoughts about that? It doesn't have anything to do with Beethoven, I'm sorry, but...
No, and it's a reasonable question. I don't like to think about it. I think, like many of us, we are muddling along as best we can in the hopes that this will just be temporary. If it's not, well, there's a lot of challenges that I've already encountered. Especially, I mean, everybody prefers the interactivity and the immediacy of being in the classroom. When you're teaching music, it's an even more acute need. So not only using electronic examples, but when it becomes necessary to try to explain something, or to even to go off on a tangent and to simply sit down at the piano to play something for students. I sing to students sometimes. Teaching is, I'm not sure maybe this is getting a question in a roundabout way, less about the media and more about it's the loss of the physical performativity of teaching that I am in mourning for right now. So I'm struggling to find ways, and I'm finding ways to teach film music, for example, finding film clips and finding ways to get students to engage online. But okay, I hope you're wrong, and I hope we go back.
I think I lost this, so I'm going to ask Kim to bring it back. Sorry about this. All right, the next question that we have begins the same way as the last one. Wonderful work, Alex. Thank you. I'd like to know which 20th century musicians you'd equate to Beethoven and which to Schoenberg, and why? And does one influence the other as Beethoven did Schoenberg? Many thanks. And it's signed, but I won't tell you.
Oh, okay. Who is the Beethoven of the 20th? Is that what we're asking, or?
And who is the Schoenberg of the 20th century?
Yeah, that's I wouldn't know how to answer that. Yeah, I wouldn't even know how to answer that. I mean, Schoenberg lived until 1951, right. And then his. I mean, there's lots of Schoenbergs of the 20th century because his legacy carried on. I mean, Stravinsky really sort of picks up where Schoenberg leaves off. That is itself an interesting kind of scenario because Stravinsky lives into the 1970s, and they are kind of competitors right up to the point where Schoenberg died, and then Stravinsky begins composing using Schoenberg's methods, which is a weird Oedipal situation. I don't think this is a question I can answer on my feet. I think I have to think about it.
Okay, well, thank you. Is there another one? As you can see, technology makes things a lot easier, but also it's pretty complicated and
requires a mediator.
Yeah. Should we see if somebody in the audience has a question, or? Oh, there's more. Lots more. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. I guess I missed the first one, so I'm going to go back to the beginning of this. If the signifier is empty or never rests, what are the implications for culture, and particularly art, that is commonly understood to represent, to teach, or to communicate? Is the implication that radicalism, whether social or musical, is without utility or point? Would you like me to repeat that? I mean, there's 3 or 4 questions, I think, here.
Sure.
But I think if you chose one of them and just...
Well, I'm grateful for the softballs that people are throwing. I struggled with this notion too. I find it compelling and quite interesting. And Zizek's analysis, especially if anybody's interested in Zizek, he's written a ton of books, and they're rambling and they're difficult to read, and they require that you know quite a bit about psychoanalytic theory. But if you're interested in this sort of idea of the analysis of popular culture in this way, there is a film. Inexplicably, there is a film that documents all of this, because Zizek uses film to explain his theories, and the film is called The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, and it contains a series of short clips where he's using film to express his ideas. So I had some reservations about using this idea, and I appreciate where this question is coming from. Yes, and I addressed it, or tried to address it, just in passing at the end of the lecture, which is that if a figure like Beethoven is merely a cipher, is entirely empty, and is just something that we project our own wishes and our own understanding on from moment to moment, then who cares? Then who cares about Beethoven? And that the question is, what does that have to do with culture? I mean, this is the fundamental question of postmodernism, I think. If you give yourself over to this idea of slippery signifiers, that nothing really means anything fundamentally, then where are you? I don't think we can go that way, and I don't think anybody is willing to go that way. And my own experience of Beethoven is rather more in line with Klimt's and Klinger's, that it is a sublime and transcendent experience to listen to Beethoven, and I don't feel that I am merely dumping content into an empty signifier in saying so.
That's a very good answer, and I do think that you can think on your feet, despite what you said earlier. We have a few more. Wonderful work, Alex. Thank you. Or maybe this is the one I just read. I'm going to read the next one. Alex, an exemplary lecture. Your use of the term revolution, though, made me think of Hannah Arendt. Revolutions are not just about renewal, but a return to the past. Is Beethoven futuristic, or really just stuck in a time that couldn't define itself?
Sure, that's a great question, and I wish I had been able to find. I was reading somebody on Beethoven who took to task this idea of Beethoven as a revolutionary. I cited John Clubb, who's recently written a book on Beethoven, and his thesis entirely rotates around this idea of Beethoven as a revolutionary. I mentioned the idea that he's a political revolutionary as well as a musical revolutionary, and the argument is that the two are inseparable. And this book is about, we could have talked at greater length about Beethoven's relationship with Napoleon, very ambivalent relationship with Napoleon, and his strong political views that he was not able to articulate in Vienna at the time. But I was reading another musicologist, I can't remember who challenged this notion. Again, we receive the heroic Beethoven through the filter of the 19th century, and that sometimes I say filter, that kind of filters out all of the other noise. So we only get one Beethoven, and that the reality is, looking at Beethoven's music, that there was a constant oscillation between tradition and what we would say sort of, I guess, the modern or the more future-oriented. So you cannot track through Beethoven's music a straightforward progression. I had originally titled this lecture, Progress is Purpose, and that is something that Beethoven had written to one of his correspondents. but they felt that title wasn't catchy. So I changed it. But so there is this idea that Beethoven certainly has this idea, maybe not expressed not as clearly or as vehemently as Schoenberg, who was insistent that music had to be new. There was no reason to compose music if it wasn't new. All great art is new music, he says, basically, because there's always a newness to it. But the reality of Beethoven's body of work, if you look at it, it's not a straight line of progress, but rather he goes forwards and backwards. It's a wonderfully apposite question, because, I mean, some of Beethoven's most progressive music, the music that was most distressing and most vexing to his contemporaries, was towards the end of his life when he turned back to, say, the fugue. So he was writing in the Baroque style. He was writing in the style of Bach in the last few years of his life. This enormous string quartet, this incredibly elaborate Bachian string quartet, and people were just like, Beethoven, I hate you. This is Beethoven, orienting himself to the past, and yet still future-minded, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It makes sense, especially to me, because one of the things that Ezra Pound talks about in terms of modern art is, he says, to make it new. That is what is modern art, which doesn't mean that you go forward. You go all the way back and make that, bring it into modern times.
I've used in some of my scholarship on Schoenberg and this period, I've used the figure of the angel of history, who is this concept of the angel of history comes from Walter Benjamin, the critic, the cultural critic, Walter Benjamin. And he takes a painting by Paul Klee of this angel, and he interprets it as what he calls the angel of history. And in Benjamin's account of history, the angel of history is a progressive figure. The angel of history moves forward, but the angel of history faces backwards. So moving into history, but facing backwards. So always looking at the past, and the past is basically, well, he's talking about the time of the First World War. So moving through history, the angel is facing backwards, always going into the future, always progressing, but always looking back at the mess and the destruction. But it's a useful symbol, this idea of, yes, there's progress, and even Schoenberg. Schoenberg felt himself to be part of a lineage of composers, that he felt Bach was modern as well, and that he made connections between his own music and Bach. So he didn't see himself as making a radical break with the past so much as on an evolutionary path. So sometimes I imagine Schoenberg as the backward-facing angel of history. He's always going forward, but almost always facing backwards at the same time.
Well, that's an interesting way of sort of positioning that in terms of perspective. Yeah. Thank you, Alex. I'm not sure where the next question comes from. It may come from a sense of disappointment that you didn't talk about this enough in your lecture tonight. No. So it's a simple question. What does any of this have to do with zombies?
Well, it does, in a way, only obliquely. This idea of the empty signifier, right? That things in culture that are so overused, that are so flexible in how they're used, that you can use them for just about anything. And I teach a course for incoming first-year students on zombies and popular culture, and use this idea, more or less, to say, why would you study zombies at all? Why would you study zombies at university? That sounds like the kind of course that you would find in a reactionary book or magazine article about what are your kids learning at school. But the reality is, that's what it has to do with zombies. Zombies are, you can use the empty signifier model with zombies too.
Okay, that's a super answer to a very difficult question, I think. And we have more like that. So the next question is, how did you get behind the rope in the imperial chambers in Vienna? So I don't know if you really want to address this question.
It's not all that salacious, but I have a friend there, a colleague, who with whom I would have taught a course this summer, past summer, if not for COVID. And COVID is hitting Austria and Vienna particularly hard at the moment. We met to talk about and plan out this summer course that we were going to teach together last fall, I suppose it was, and he asked me if I wanted to come up to see his office, and I said, sure. And so we went to his office, and it so happens that the old imperial palace, part of it is a museum, and part of it is unused, is closed, and part of it is leased out by the University of Vienna for professors' offices. So I went up to see his office, it was quite surreal. He took me in sort of through the back passages and through the Imperial Palace, which I had been through in the tourist tour. But he took me through the back and then opened the door to his office, and I stepped in, 20-foot ceiling with a fresco on the top, and it was like, this is exactly like Augustana. And then we were looking around, and it just got weirder and weirder. He went, do you want to see the Empress's bathroom and that kind of thing? And then we just sort of walked past this little door, and he goes, oh, this is cool. And he opened the door, and I stepped out, and I was on the balcony. And he said, do you know where you are? And I looked down, and I recognized where I was, and he said, this is the emperor's private balcony. Cool. And he took a picture, and I had the big, huge grin on my face.
Well, it's interesting where an academic life will take you.
Yes, for sure.
In all these exotic
Yeah.
places. And I'm asked that question sometimes, and my answer is always that before you get there, you have to do a lot of work.
That's true.
Work over 10, 20 years, so that you're in a position to go to Vienna. So it's not easy, and that was the point I tried to make by using Yeats's poem, because what we do seems maybe intellectually tough, but it's actually physically demanding.
That's true.
But it's nice to go to those places anyways. We don't have any questions. I don't think we have any questions here, but there might be questions from the audience in this room. Does anybody have a question? And if you don't, it's okay, because I think that Alex has been speaking for about an hour or more.
And there's a line here on the stage that I'm not allowed to cross.
Yeah.
So you can come close to the stage now. I won't get close.
I'll ask you one, and then if there are no other questions, we'll finish this. One of the things that I find out in terms of teaching, because when I looked at your record to try to come up with something to say tonight, and of course I've looked at some of the things that you've done already, or I had looked, I'm really impressed by the way in which you bring together the scholarship and the lesson, the teaching. I just want you to think about perhaps an instance or two where you're in the classroom and a student asks a question, sometimes a challenging question, and the light goes on in one's brain, and there is the article, there is the next project. Have you had anything like that? In other words, what I'm asking is that in what way, in a university, in an institution like this, which is largely undergraduate, I know that you do some graduate work on the North Campus, but in an institution with undergraduate students, how do they motivate us to do the work that we do?
Oh gosh, that is a good question. I have had that experience. I find it difficult I've published with one of my students, which only once, and and that's something that I didn't think that I would ever do, that I would publish with an undergraduate student. But I had a student who was working with me as a research assistant, but also taking an individual course, a directed studies course, and his work was so interesting, and then it just ended up sort of shifting over slightly and kind of aligning with something that I was thinking about doing. And then I think that was a moment where my thinking and my energy was just catalyzed by supervising what my student was doing with no I was thinking, in the graduate context, in the context of doctoral studies, it can often happen that graduate students are unwittingly doing the research work of one of their professors, thinking that they're taking a course or something like that, and it turns out that you're just building the bibliography for the guy's next book. So I wasn't doing that, but this was a genuine sort of moment. But otherwise, I wish I could say I find the whole experience, maybe with the zombie stuff, maybe, because that's a very intense experience. It takes place over the first 3 weeks of the term, and you're with the students for 3 hours a day, and it's hours and hours of preparation, as my family can attest to. It's horrifying, not because it's zombies, but because I'm up at 5 o'clock in the morning watching zombie films to be ready for class at 9 o'clock in the morning. And that kind of immersion and that close contact with the students and in an in-person class especially, just the continuous back and forth, and that has really activated my scholarship in that area.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So do we have a question from the floor? I'll count to 3, and then if you don't... Oh, yes, please go ahead.
One thing that struck me that I didn't know was, like, in modern times, music is used very politically. But you were saying, like, in the Second World War, they liked Beethoven, and Wagner was another one that the Nazis really liked.
Yeah, for sure.
How far back does music and politics go together? Is that like, I've never taken music history, so
Yeah.
I'm like curious about that.
So I'll repeat the question just because I think
Just go ahead.
the people who are watching the live stream can't hear. But the question was, how far back does the relationship between politics and classical music go? Yeah, sure. Well, this is the subject of a 2-hour lecture. So, lock the doors? No. Anyway, that's a very good question. Beethoven was a very political composer. But again, in the context of Vienna, Vienna is the capital of the Austrian Empire. At that time, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. So you have to be pretty careful about what you say. I mentioned Beethoven's Third Symphony. He initially was very pro-Napoleon at a time when it looked like Napoleon was going to sort of, the Napoleonic wave was going to kind of revitalize Europe, and then Napoleon sort of just became essentially a military dictator. And so Beethoven very famously had written a dedication to Napoleon on the score of his symphony, and then after Napoleon, well, he attacked Vienna. He scratched the name out, and I think that document still survives. You can see that in the archives where the name has been scratched out. But it's such a huge question. The history of opera is so political. The opera stage was a place where composers could, in very tentative ways, offer political criticism and social criticism, especially criticism of the ruling classes of the aristocracy. At the same time, opera served the function of bolstering, of kissing up also, right? So French opera in the Baroque era, every opera is basically about the king. Whoever is the hero of the opera is understood to be allegorically Louis XIV, essentially. So, and then, as you say, in the 20th century, that was the point that I was trying to make, and I guess playing off of Zizek's point as well, that this music can mean radically different things. It can be politicized. Zizek is doing political criticism, essentially. He's talking about music becoming an ideological vessel, a container. You can dump Nazism into it, and then you can dump it out and dump communism into it, and then you can dump that out and dump the racial politics of an apartheid regime into it, and everybody's listening to Beethoven somehow, and for political reasons.
But as far as music or song goes, as it's used sort of by armies, that goes back to the classical Greek and Roman times, where armies marched to a song and later to music.
For the ancient Greek, for Plato, music is political as early back as Plato, right? Music is fundamental to the development of the state. Right? You have to be very careful about the kinds of citizens you create in school, and boys especially. Boys may listen to certain kinds of music that will make them good soldiers and will make them tough and good administrators, but not music that will make them sensitive or in touch with their feelings. That's not allowed.
So I expect, Alex, your next proposal for a new course to be political music from Plato to Beethoven.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Any other questions? Yes, please go ahead.
I was just wondering with yourself, when you get your courses together, whether it's related to what we just heard or to zombies, what is your core sort of fundamental belief as a professor that you want to give to your students when you're thinking about pulling all your information together?
That's a wonderful question. Well, what I want for them, it's in a way, what you're talking about, the assembly of information. That all has to happen as a matter of course, or there won't be a course. But I'm less concerned. Increasingly, I'm less concerned about conveying information or packing students with information, and more that they will think, that they will engage, that they'll argue with me, that they'll argue with each other. I don't care so much about, I have X amount of, a certain volume of information that I have to convey. This is a traditional way, and I don't know how many people go by it anymore, but I've only got 13 weeks, and I've got to get from here to here, and by hell or high water, I will say all of these things. I will give the students all of these dates, and I will give them all of these terms, and to the extent that I can do that, I do. But when things go off on interesting tangents, and we lose half a class to an interesting discussion, to an unplanned debate, or a sudden interest in a topic that I hadn't planned to cover, and then suddenly everything has to shift to accommodate that, because clearly suddenly it's important and the students want to understand it. I wish I had a better answer, but ultimately I want them to think and not have any use for me by the time they're done.
Thank you, Alex, for that. Anyone else? Okay, I don't see anyone else wishing to ask a question. I'm not sure who came up with this idea, this tradition of having this distinguished professorship or lectures by people who have just been anointed as full professors. But of course, it's a wonderful idea, and for me, it's a wonderful way of showing off our very best professors, who are not only great teachers, as you would expect in a place like Augustana, but as in Alex's case, great researchers and great scholars. And I always believe that scholarship goes hand in hand with teaching, and they feed each other. And I think Dr. Carpenter is an example, a paradigm of that. So I'd like to thank you, not just for tonight's lecture and for entertaining us for about an hour, but also for all your accomplishments, which make me at least, but I think your Augustana colleagues as well, very proud.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Alex one more time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.